Okay guys, I'm going to walk you guys through several poems, and I'm going to do it pretty much as fast as I possibly can. So we're not just looking at theme in this lecture, though I did title it theme. We are looking at theme, symbol, allegory, myth, kind of a catch-all of some of the things we talked about. So the first is Yet Do I Marvel by County Cullen, and this poem is by, County Cullen was a huge figure in the Harlem Renaissance. He kind of advocated for the disparities between the races to not just be glossed over, but to be acknowledged and kind of openly discussed. So this poem is essentially about what it is to be African American. Its central theme is sort of the disparity between the races. You could also say the central theme is what it is to be an artist, as a marginalized artist or an outsider. Essentially, it's focusing on kind of the cruelty of being someone who has something to say, but in a place where you're not allowed to say it. So he says, I doubt not God is good, well meaning and kind, and he did stoop to quibble, could tell why the little buried mole continues blind. So why is life unfair, essentially? God is good, but why is life unfair? And he gives us these images of this little mole being blind, or the flesh that mirrors him must die. So he's giving us a biblical allusion to the idea of from earth, from ashes to ashes, dust to dust, we die. And he says, I don't quite understand all of these sort of disparities in life, but why does he make plain the reason tortured Tantalus? So here we have an allusion to a Greek myth. Tantalus was the one tantalizing, who was forced to stand in water, and every time he stooped to drink, the water would lower just enough that he couldn't reach it, and every time he tried to reach up where there was food and a fruit on a tree above his head, it would move just out of reach. So he was sort of tortured by having to have something just out of reach, something he wanted just out of reach for his entire life. So we have this allusion to this tortured figure who wants something but can't quite get it. It says, is baited by the physical fruit, declare if merely a caprice dooms Sisyphus to struggle up a never-ending stair. So Sisyphus was one who was doomed, again, another Greek allusion, who was doomed to roll the boulder up the hill over and over again just to have it come back down. So it's a never-ending struggle. It's a never-ending battle. It's something that is just out of reach that you could never quite have. This, to him, is the central theme of what it is to be an African-American man in America. It's not quite fair. It says, inscrutable as his, God, capitalized, his ways are, and immune to catechisms by a mind too strewn with petty cares to slightly understand what awful brain compels his awful hand. So he's saying, God is great. God, I am sure, has reasons for this. So he's building up this idea of God is all-knowing and all-being, but there's these sort of disparities or unfair moments in life, and he's kind of questioning why they exist, and he says, yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. So this ironic statement is County Cullen, saying it is a cruel joke to make someone gifted with words, gifted with voice, and make them a marginalized group in society where that voice is constantly oppressed. That is what he's saying. And he's saying it almost in a satirical way, which is very interesting. We're going to move to My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Rothke. So this was written, Theodore Rothke, he lived through the wars as a child, and this is kind of about the post-war trauma that settled into a lot of American men who had been on the front line. And it's a very interesting poem because it has this sort of waltz-like rhythm to it. It says, the whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death, such waltzing was not easy. And the waltz here, of course, is not a waltz. It is a metaphor for the dance between this little boy and his father, as his father tries to basically beat him night after night after night, take out sort of the post-war trauma and the PTSD with drink and abuse. And you never get that directly from him. So through the image of these waltzing figures and the rhythm that's put forth with this, you get this understanding of what the waltz actually is and consists of. And we have these sensory images. So I'm trying to make sure that you guys don't forget all of the things we talked about. All of these elements are in all of these poems. It's just I'm breaking them down differently based on sort of each week's focus. But you do have sensory imagery here. You have the whiskey on your breath. Everybody knows what that sort of drunkard smell is. It says it could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. This simile. I hung on like death. I did everything I could to not let go. Such waltzing was not easy. So we romped until the pan slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not have found itself. So it's very understated. We romped until the pan. So we went back and forth. You tried to essentially hit and beat until the kitchen was destroyed. It says, the hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. So you get the impression that he's a child because his ear is the same level as his father's belt buckle. So every time his father misses, you get the visual image that his right ear is being scraped by that belt buckle. It says, you beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. So you beat time on my head. So you get that waltz imagery with the 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and with a palm kicked hard by dirt. So he was a hardworking man. And he says, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. So then literally picked me up and took me off to make me go to bed. And he says, night after night this happened. So you get this sort of bitterness, and this is a confessional poem where he's talking about his relationship with his father, and you get this sort of bitterness as the tone, or sort of broken innocence, essentially. And the theme here is just that. It's sort of broken innocence. It's survival. It's trying to understand exactly how a father could do this to a child. General view of the sex situation. This is an interesting one. Dorothy Parker was a journalist and an advocate, and this is a very glib poem. It's very short and simple, and she's satirically calling out the differences in how the sexes treat the idea of love. She says, woman wants monogamy, man delights in novelty. This is universal woman, universal man. Love is a woman's moon and sun. Man has other forms of fun. So note the end rhymes, of course. So love is essentially all-encompassing, supposed to be all-encompassing to women, whereas men have other forms of fun. So here this means forms outside of marriage, essentially. So we have sex outside of marriage, we have gambling, we have all these sort of vices that men in the 30s were doing. It says, woman lives but in her Lord. So she's making fun of this idea that a woman is supposed to be all encompassed or all ensconced in her husband. Count to 10 and man is bored. So she's basically making fun of the fact that men have kind of a very easily shifting eye. And she says, with this, the gist and sum of it, what earthly good can come of it. So she's saying there's a disparity in how the sexes are expected to behave in relationships and in love. And what is love essentially in sort of this differences in the sexes. And she's arguing that women should be allowed essentially to either not have their identity tied up in their significant other, or that they should be allowed some level of freedom to the same extent as men. So sex here, of course, meaning sex and gender, and sex meaning sex. So this was a very interesting poem for 1933. Dulcem et decorum est is by Wilfred Owen. It is a beautiful poem that looks at the idea that war is futile. That's really the theme here. And so we have these images of these soldiers who are bent double like old beggars under sacks. So these similes, they're old beggars, knock-kneed. Again, we have this really nice assonance and alliteration that's happening. Knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we curse through the sludge. So they're going through essentially what the reality of war is. This, and Wilfred Owen, he was writing at the end of World War I. Basically, World War I essentially shattered the notion of what war was. We had never seen a war on that scale. We had never seen the reality of war in that sense. And this poetry, the poetry of World War I and II poets, was really significant in helping bring that sort of harsh reality of war to life in a way that never had been done. So we see sort of them marching. Men had lost their boots. They limped on, bloodshot, all went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. So we even have an onomatopoeia here. We have the hoots, which is an interesting term because hoots is generally a sexualized term. The hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. So all of this, if you notice, is the language is very measured and it keeps this sort of steady rhythm, even though there is no rhyme scheme essentially here. There is a rhyme scheme, even though there's no steady meter. I apologize. No steady meter. It says gas, and then we get this kind of break. We have this like sort of, I don't want to say soft, but kind of calm beginning where it's just monotonous and it's kind of the same line structure, the same kind of sound. And then we have a quick break. Gas, gas, quick, boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. We get this pace that sort of picks up here. It says someone's yelling and stumbling and flowering, blah, blah, blah. And he sees people under this green sea of poison gas drowning. And he says, in all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. So we have this very harsh language here, and these harsh consonant sounds, guttering, choking, drowning. And he says, and if in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind a wagon that we flung him and this man that died, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face. And note that internal assonance, white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin. So this is a very grotesque image here. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth corrupted lungs, obscene as the cancer, bitter as the cud. So these similes that he's using are incredibly powerful. Vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory. The old lie, dulcem et decorum est, pro patria mori. So this is, again, the Roman poet Horace, allusion to his line, which says, essentially, it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Okay, now we have a different view of love. And Pablo Neruda is a Chilean poet who is perhaps one of the greatest love poets of all time. He wrote absolutely gorgeous love poetry. So I wanted to kind of compare him to Dorothy Parker's over here. But tonight I can write the saddest lines. Write, for example, the night is shattered and the blue stars shiver in the distance. The night wind revolves in the sky and sings, tonight I can write the saddest lines. So we have these refrains which you'll see kind of throughout. So we have this broken-hearted love story. He says, I loved her, and someday she loved me too. Through nights like this, I held her in my arms. So we have this sort of free verse, but there is some rhyme scheme in here. We have arms, sky, to eyes. So sky and eyes is a slant rhyme. It's very close. So again, we have the refrain of tonight, I can write the saddest lines. So he's talking about what it is to have loved and lost, essentially. That's the central theme here. What does it matter that my love could not keep her? The night is shattered, she's not with me. And you see this language is lamenting, it's sad, it's my soul is not satisfied that it has lost her. So he's personifying his soul. My sight searches for her as though to go to her. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but love is so short, forgetting is so long. So this really here is the theme. That we never forget love. Love is ever present, and love is tragic. So, last one, I Hear America Singing by Walt Whitman. Sorry, we're having an issue here. Let me go over here. I Hear America Singing is one of Whitman's greatest poems. Whitman was an American poet laureate. He did JFK's inaugural address. He is truly a national treasure, and his understanding of what America is put forth. And as you read, I want you to kind of think about how he characterizes America. That's really the central theme here. So he says, I hear America singing the varied carols. And Whitman wrote in free verse. He was very unique in that, so keep that in mind. He said, the varied carols I hear. You could argue that things like varied carols has an internal rhyme. Those are mechanics, each one singing his as it should be blithe and strong. The carper singing his as he measures his plank or beam. The mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work. So we do have free verse, but we do have this sort of rhythm that kind of gets established here with the repetition of the structure of each line. So we have the noun and the verb singing, and then we have sort of the action phrase. So the boatman does this, the shoemaker does this, the woodcutter's song is this. Each of these sort of figures are essentially archetypal figures in and of themselves. We have the mason, the carpenter, the boatman, the shoemaker. They're all blue collar. They're all laborers, and they're all part of the fabric of America, essentially, here. Note that he's not talking about the Wall Street executive or the robber baron like Vanderbilt or any of these sort of larger-than-life figures. He's talking about the everyday, workaday people. He says, delicious singing of the mother or the young wife at work or the girl sewing or washing, each singing what belongs to him or her and to no one else. So this idea of individualism and pride in individualism and sort of pride in the idea that you get what you work for and what you earn is yours, this capitalist ideal, is something that Whitman did write about a lot. So there's multiple themes in here that you could really kind of paint. He says, the day what belongs to the day, and the night the party of young fellow, robust and friendly, singing with open mouths their strong melodious songs. So the language here is extremely strong. It's not soft, it's not flowing, it's not sonnet-like, it's straightforward and strong, and that is the type of people that he's painting here. So you could argue the theme here is that the fabric of America is made up on the backs of, its workers. You could argue that the idea of the individual is central to freedom in America. There's so many different things you could argue here. So that is kind of a nice selection of poetry, and hopefully you enjoyed.